everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we are heading back into the basics of economics here in our economic and personal finance course. So today we're going to talk about the four main different types of markets, what they are, how they're different, and give you some examples of them. You're familiar with most of these. You've probably just never really put it into the little vocab word compartment in your brain to understand the different types of markets that exist present day. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about a modern economy, you might just think money or how society works, or maybe nothing, because this is what we're going to talk about in this course. And you're not wrong in any of that, because we are going to walk through the four main types of economies, basically how a country manages the concept of scarcity, where all their people have all these wants, but there's only a limited amount of resources. Regardless of how many resources you have, there's still only a limited amount. So the four main types of markets that exist today that we're going to talk about is the traditional economic system, the command economic system, the market economic system, and the mixed economic system. So these four types of markets really encompass any possible type of economy that exists modern day. Now, different countries have very different economies. North Korea's economy, all right, is going to be very different than America's. So why is that? If economics is supposed to be a science, why doesn't everybody just do what the best economy is? Well, because there's a bunch of variables, like math, that go into play when deciding what type of economy your society is going to have. Whether you're going to have one where people can just do whatever they want and make what they want, sell what they want, and that's fine, or one where the government comes in and tells people what they can and cannot make and then control everything. So how do we determine, or how do countries determine what type of economy they're going to be? So it would be an oversimplification to say, well, the best economies, or a certain type of economy, are economies that have a bunch of resources. Well, here are the top 10 countries on Earth, the natural resources valued by country, and they all have very different economies. Like Russia and the United States are 1 and 2, and very different economies. So why? All right, if it's not just based on the amount of resources, what causes this to happen? Well, geography is a big part of it. All right. So while resources do play a big role in obviously the type of markets that you're going to have, that basically how you divide those resources up, there are other issues at play. So while a country might have a bunch of resources, if they have a ton of people, the amount of resources per person gets smaller. So that's why these countries with a lot of resources, if they have a huge population, you have to make sure for your country that you've created a market that is suitable for your people. You will also notice that because geography plays a huge part in what type of market you're going to have, that a lot of the different markets, countries with different markets, are kind of grouped together. So like Russia, China, these countries over here that are in the orange, they have massive populations. All right, with their huge populations, even though if they have a lot of resources, they still have to try to make it fair. So they have more of what's a command economy, where they basically, the government goes in and says what they can or can't have. Countries, a lot of times, that have a lot of resources and smaller populations, it's more of a free-formed market economy is a common situation. The reason geography plays a huge part is because if a market ends up basing it on logic, becomes the best thing for country A to manage, like a certain type of market that we'll talk about here, then it makes sense that these surrounding countries are probably dealing with the same situations that first country did. And so it's not uncommon to see countries have the same economies based on where their location is. So they'll be clumped together. So like America, we have a mixed economy. Spoiler alert. We're going to be surrounded by a lot of mixed economies. Whereas command economies, like in China and North Korea to an extreme, we'll talk about them. They are around each other as they have more limited resources per person. So the question here is, explain how geography and resources can dictate what kind of market a country will have. So to clarify that here is we're going to go in and it all makes sense at the end of this lesson, hopefully. You have a certain amount of resources. Talked about scarcity yesterday. So you have a certain amount of resources. How do you divide those resources up fairly among a population? And that basically dictates your market. So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right, so we'll start with the traditional economy. This is obviously traditional, means like the old way of doing things. Traditional economies are almost non-existent now. So a traditional economy, this is almost like a barter system. Tribes in Africa still occasionally will still use a traditional economic system. Basically how you have resources, like what jobs people have, what they do, is really like a lineage, like a family thing that you do, or the whole community works together. There's very little job specialization in traditional economic systems. This is where everybody kind of does their own thing, kind of like the pioneers that we talked about yesterday. It is more common in traditional economies for people to kind of do everything and not have one necessarily set group of skills. A lot of times these are hunter and gatherer societies, relies on barters. They produce what is needed. There's very little waste. So there is no large scale example I can tell you, but the one that I think you will be the most familiar with is the Inuit people in northern Canada. Sometimes called Eskimo. It's not a term that is used, Eskimo, but it's the Inuit people. They still have a traditional economy. So in this really, really hostile environment that they live in, they all work together. There is no real job specialization. There's not like an igloo builder that goes out and builds igloos. Everybody works together on that. They have a very rough lifestyle because they're living out in the wilderness because it's snow. So there isn't really job specialization because they're all kind of fighting against the environment. Another big reason why the Inuit people are still a traditional economy is one of their main sources of resources. Their main resource are whales. All right. So, and they kill the whales and use all the parts of the whale for their entire society. That is an entire community effort to kill a whale and bring a whale onto shore and to be able to use it. So there really isn't job specializations in the Inuit people, and they are one of the few remaining examples of a traditional economy. All the other economies we're going to talk about have gotten much more advanced and have different perspectives on how they want to divide up the different types of resources that they have in their society. Here, when your main resource is whale and survive the temperatures and the environment, they still can function in a traditional environment without having job specialization. So the question here is, since most jobs and careers are based on lineage and family careers in traditional societies, why would job specialization be much less likely in traditional societies? So why does the Inuit people not have a guy that builds chairs? Why does everybody in an Inuit society typically all work towards a common goal? Pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right, command economy. So this is old school. The Egyptians had this, like a pharaoh, a dictator, and basically decided what was going to be done in society. Basically the government, or one person in the pharaoh's case, owns all the resources in the entire country, and they decide what gets built and how and who uses it and who it benefits. So the characteristics of a command economic system, and we still have those today, they've varied some since the pharaohs, is that the government or the central power owns the means of production. So they own the factories. They basically decide who can use what. If it's natural resources in their country, if it's oil, if it's whatever it is, the government owns that. The government will decide what is produced and how much, There is some definitely downsides to command economic systems. It is really hard to change when the government's kind of function and making like definitive decisions. It's hard to be flexible in an economic process like that if the economy changes, if there's different demands around the world. It's hard to change. There's also very little entrepreneurship that shows up. A lot less people trying to go out and be successful because there's very few choices on ways to be successful. So some of the modern countries, Cuba as less so than it used to be, China, who's communist, because communist is a command type of economy. The USSR, the Soviet Union, USSR doesn't even exist anymore, but the Soviet Union, Russia, has moved away from it, but the USSR was an extreme example of a command economy, and the most extreme example that still exists today is North Korea. So the most common form of command economy that exists now is communism. So the concept of communism is the fact that the government owns all the means of production. Usually communist nations have success in countries that have limited natural resources or are struggling, or the people are struggling to adequately provide for themselves using the resources that are available. This is one of the reasons that Russia, where all the super rich people were like taking all the money and a lot of the poor people were like starving to death. This is one of the reasons that Russia turned to the Soviet Union and were successful for a long time, is because the government comes in, takes the existing resources and divides it up fairly among all the people. All right. So this way, there's not a haves and have-nots. Everybody has equal access to it, and that happens in a command economy where the government takes over all the resources. All right, because again, the idea of scarcity, unlimited wants by everybody, limited resources. Regardless of how many resources you don't have enough. But if you really don't have enough, so the most common, well-known, extreme example of a command economy today is North Korea. So North Korea, because of a whole bunch of politics that we get into it, the rest of the world isn't going to play nice with North Korea because North Korea is kind of trying to pick fights with people it shouldn't pick fights with. So it's a whole nother thing outside of economics. But nobody will trade with North Korea, which is devastating for resources when you don't have a ton of resources to begin with. So North Korea, which is here in red, led by this guy named Kim Jong-un here in the picture, who's my age. So he has complete and total say-so in North Korea. North Korea really struggles for resources because nobody will trade with them because of military stuff and a bunch of and human rights violations, these other things. So while South Korea has tons of natural resources because they trade with the rest of the world, North Korea doesn't have the resources. So Kim Jong-un here, he goes out and he has to make the decisions on what gets produced, who works what job, and it's completely controlled by the government. This, in theory, should prevent people from starving to death, but it does not necessarily, in command economies, promote having an advanced society. This is a modern picture I'm going to show you, and this is crazy. This is an aerial view at night, an actual photograph from space in North Korea. Those little lines on the side are drawn in, the white lines. Notice South Korea is lit up at night. That's China above it, lit up at night. North Korea is almost completely dark. There's a lot of places in North Korea, and you can tell by this map, that don't have electricity. This is modern photograph. So a command economy is effective when taking a small amount of resources and dividing it up among everybody so that they can all like survive. But there's very little extreme productivity that's going to take place in any type of command economy. The Soviet Union tried to do that, but there's a whole bunch of other reasons that we'll get into in later lessons on why command economies typically are not successful. So the question here, give a pro and a con for a command economy in which the government decides which goods will be produced. So what's a positive of a command economy? Like without Kim Jong-un, now granted without him, some of those decisions that got him cut off from the rest of the world might have. Anyway, so they are taking the limited resources and fairly dividing it up among everybody. But the downside of it is very limited abilities to move up or to grow your economy in a command economy. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So the market economy. This is the third time. So we went traditional, the hunters and gatherers, classic stuff, the Inuit people. We got command economy. This is like communism. This is like North Korea. So the market economy, I bet that's what America is. So you would think so. All right. So this is a pure capitalist economy. Like absolutely, this is going to be America. Hold on now. So in a market economy, private enterprise owns the means of the production. The government does not involve itself at all in economic decisions. They run on self-interest and competition. Supply and demand fully run a market economy, meaning what people want is what gets produced and people buy it, and that's how the market goes. That entire concept in a market economy is called the invisible hand. There is no regulation. There is no regulation at all. You can do whatever, you can make whatever you want, sell whatever you want. What gets made is what people will buy. Supply and demand completely dictate what gets made. If there's demand for it, then the businesses know they will make that, sell it, make money. Because where there's demand, there's money. If demand goes up, the price of stuff goes up. If you want the brand new toy for Christmas, all right, and everybody wants it, you better believe the price of it's going to go up. So when there's demand in a market economy, they're going to try to create more supply, all right? So it is called the invisible hand that supply and demand dictate what gets made and what gets spent in a market economy. All right, so visible hand, supply and demand controls everything. So supply, demand, no government interaction, and this is capitalism, supply and demand, control money. So you're like, okay, so America's capitalist, cool, that's what America is. So we were at first. Laissez-faire economics. If you've had me for history classes before, you've heard me talk about it. Laissez-faire economics. The government originally, when we were founded, just says, cool, just figure it out. Have at it. It was the market revolution. The fact that the United States government was cool with people being millionaires. Well, in the late 1800s, we realized that was a problem. Because what happened was when there's no government oversight, you had a handful of people really create monopolies and really negatively impacted the rest of society. So instead of like in a command economy where the government controls like 80, 90% of the resources, it ended up being like private individuals who got super successful, and then there's no competition. They controlled it, and they didn't have an incentive to try to look out for the people like a government would. So the government had to come in and start putting restrictions and get somewhat involved. And we'll talk about what our government is now, which is a mixed economy. We're getting ready to talk about that. But there are still examples present day. I want to give you a present day example of how a market economy works. I want to use a very specific kind of go on smaller scale instead of a big country. Let's talk about the NBA and the WNBA, the National Basketball Association and the Women's National Basketball Association. This is a market economy. So these are the two highest paid players in the NBA and the WNBA at the time of this recording. So on the left, Steph Curry makes $40.2 million per year to play basketball. The highest paid woman there makes $127,000 a year to play basketball. They literally both do the same thing. They train their tails off, work as hard as they possibly can to go out and play basketball. But he makes $40 million, she makes $127,000. That seems unfair. This is the invisible hand at work. So, and we're going to walk through this, just because a market economy is fair, meaning it is dictated by supply and demand, does not mean it is equal at all. So the amount of money that the NBA brings in every year is $7.4 billion. The WNBA, $60 million. Because people want to watch the NBA. People have shown that, and not in the same numbers, don't want to watch the WNBA. The average salary of an NBA player is $6.4 million a year. The average salary of a WNBA player is $71,000. The ticket price to an NBA basketball game is $89. Ticket price to a WNBA game is $17. This seems wild, all right? But that's accurate. That is the market that people would have shown, this data, would rather go see the NBA than the WNBA. And because they're spending their money to watch the NBA and not the WNBA, the WNBA doesn't have the same money to pay their players. So if you just look at these salaries here, it looks completely unfair. Completely unfair. But in a market economy where there is no government regulation of this, because it is a free market in this specific environment, this is completely fair when you allow it to be run by supply and demand. Just because it's fair does not mean equal in a market economy. So the question here is, explain how supply and demand control a market economy. Where there's demand for stuff, there will be a supply. If there's demand for men's basketball, there will be a supply. People will spend money on it. There's more money for the men's basketball league. If there's not as much demand for the women's basketball league, there's not going to be as much money there. So that was a small example, but on a large scale, there are very few, I don't know of any off the top of my head, that are still a market economy, pure and simple, with no government oversight now. America was probably one of the last ones that really tried it on a large scale. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So this brings us to a mixed economy. This is what America is now, all right? America is a mixed economy. So what does that mean? It's a mix of both market and command economy. So in a mixed economy, the means of production are controlled by both private enterprises and governments. Government influences supply and demand through regulation and interventionist policies. Capital is reallocated based on need. Profit is the main driver, but governments use these to help improve social mobility. All right, Mr. Wagstaff, what does that mean? All right. So mixed economies are most of the economies on Earth now. So the mixed economies that are capitalist leaning is like the United States and Japan are probably the most capitalist leaning ones there are. So North Korea, might as well just put them over there in communism, but China and Venezuela, they are left, all right, of this, where there's more command of a society. If you see the word socialism, we'll talk more about it in civics, but socialism just means that the government gets involved. By the basic definition of socialism, in which the government tries to make life better for everybody by government regulation, America already is socialist and have been for over 100 years. There's different variations of it, and America would be one of the least socialist countries, but like England's socialist, Canada's socialist. It's not, socialism and communism are not interchangeable. Anyway, getting off topic here a little bit. So America, going back to those monopolies, America really stopped being a market economy when you had these different industries: the steel industry, the oil industry, the railroad tycoons, your Rockefellers, your Carnegies. These guys came out and basically ruined it for everybody else. They controlled entire areas of America, and the problem with that is when there's no competition, and competition is super necessary for any effective market. We'll talk a lot more about that in this unit. With a monopoly, there's no competition. So if you own every railroad in the 1800s, when railroads are really important, if you owned every railroad, you could just jack up the price of your railroad tickets and nobody could afford it. That would be devastating. So the government came in and said, all right, now the government doesn't come in and take over these monopolies. They passed this thing called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which, see that little dude over there? And that was kind of the start of this. The government says, all right, we're not going to take over the railroads, but you're not allowed to own more than 40% of the railroad company. To these guys, like, you have to break it up. So trust and monopoly, pretty much interchangeable here for this course, that you have to break it up to create competition. So a mixed economy, especially in America, we allow people to go out and be super rich, but you can't prevent other people from getting rich themselves. So America does things now that prevent that, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act. You can't have a monopoly. You can't, if it's something everybody needs, like gasoline, you can't own all the gas stations in America and then jack the price up. You do that, the government's going to come in, not going to put you in jail or anything, but they'll make you sell like 50% of your gas stations to other people so that there's competition. The government will get involved and make sure there's competition. Other things the government will do modern day is big focus on the environment. The government is going to start and has been giving incentives to car companies to make electric vehicles as opposed to gas-powered vehicles so that it can make a lower carbon footprint. While people might be more apt to buy a gas-powered car over an electric car, all things considered, if the government gives the electric car companies extra money to lower their prices, and the electric cars are cheaper than the gas cars, that way the people will start buying electric cars, and in that case, it benefits the environment. So the government, while in a mixed economy, allows the private people to own everything and do what they want, the government will put their hand on the scale here and there and regulate stuff to make sure it's fair, and the theory is that it's supposed to help the most amount of people possible while still letting people be proactive in going out and being rich and successful. So the question here, how does the combined influence of the government and prices help a mixed economy? So the influence of the government, basically deciding what's best for people, like you can't go buy a nuclear warhead. You're like, yeah, of course you couldn't. You might laugh about that. In a market economy, sure, if you had enough money and there's somebody that's building a nuke, you could buy it. There's no government regulation. The government's going to jump in and be like, you can't buy a nuke. A private person cannot go have an Apache helicopter with missiles. You can't have that. So the government does have regulations. So that's the influence of government. But at the same time, the government also needs to make sure that all the prices for these products remain, especially when it comes to like food and gas and things that we need. The government is very keen on trying to make sure that those prices are as fair and normal as possible, so that it doesn't negatively impact people like when monopolies happen and they jacked up the price of everything. So answer that completely, and that's as far as we're going to get today. I'll see you guys tomorrow.